Well, welcome again, and Rick, thanks for joining us today on the podcast. A pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to have you on. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about your book. You know, we talked about this a few times. We met a few weeks ago up in your neck of the woods, up in St. Augustine. Talked a little bit about it, and I said, we had to have him on the podcast to talk some about his experiences and maybe impart some wisdom to the new generation of intelligence officers, even anyone considering government service. I think this is an important show for you in light of what's happening right now in Washington D.C., which is quite a bit. I think it's a lot of it's unprecedented. So, starting off with your book, Black Ops: The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote it. But before we get to that, tell people a little bit about yourself. I think what you've done and uh, is the sort of work that most people associate with government service, but I want you to put it in your own words. What drove you to join the CIA, and what can you share with us about your work during that long period in your life?
Well, as you know, I'm Cuban born. I lived under the Castro regime. My parents couldn't get out, so I went out at the age of 10 through the Peter Pan program to an orphanage in Pueblo, Colorado. And the reason I started there is because I truly believe that God puts a path in front of us. And if we choose it, He also prepares us for that path. And I believe even those early experiences started forging my mettle towards where I was going. My parents came out about 9 months, less than a year later. Um, Went back to Miami. That's where I grew up in the Hialeah, Miami area. Then I went into an elite unit in the military called Pararescue, Air Force Pararescue. Very shortly after high school, I developed a conscience for the debt of honor that I had for this country. You know, the fact that they've taken me and my family in, and so many other, people from the destroyed countries. Um, so that well, 6 months later, I had signed up for the Air Force Pararescue, and I went there. My goal was to go to Vietnam. By the time the pipeline for all special operations training in the military is anywhere between a year and a half and 2 years. So by the time that I got my coveted Maroon Beret, um, the war in Vietnam was pretty much over because I went in December of 71. So by 73, that was not it wasn't going to happen. So I stayed in the military reserves for a total of 10 years.
Security
And
years. Wow.
yeah, almost 10 years. And it was during the latter part of my reserve time, around 1980, that I applied to the agency. Uh,
So let me interrupt you right there. Before we get to the agency phase of that, first of all, thank you for your service. I know you hear that a lot, but I think it's good to say it because a lot of times folks who do the work you do never really get the credit. I know you don't do it for the credit, but it's important for people to know that it's it's a lifetime that you gave to this, and you and your colleagues do this quietly all the time, day in, day out. Nobody knows you're doing it, and it's important to recognize it. Before we get to your service in the CIA, for those who don't know, what is pararescue? So folks know understand what that is. I get a lot of questions about that.
Pararescue is a special unit. The military writ large comes under special operations writ large comes under Special Operations Command out of Tampa, SOCOM. And that is composed of Army Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Air Force Pararescue and Combat Controllers, and Marine Raiders. Those
Okay.
are the five primary. Rangers also play a part on that, but they're a different tier. Um, it is our mission is forever to go into denied areas and bring back personnel that are either stranded or wounded. Uh, we go through scuba school, parachuting school, mountain climbing school, hand-to-hand schools, all the SEER school, and which is interrogation and survival stuff. But at the end of the day, our main thing is we are EMT2s. We're very advanced paramedics that can go in behind enemy lines and bring back a downed pilot or a special operations team that's stuck out there and they have wounded. That is our primary job.
You know, when I was reading your book, it comes across as if you were almost born for this sort of thing. I mean, you seem to relish it. It comes across in what you say and how you say it. And it's pretty remarkable that you kind of had that vocation, that calling so young. When you first did that work, what was going through your mind? Like when your first mission, how was it? Because it was as if you were preparing, like you knew you were going to do it. But what was going through your mind your very first time you did this?
Well, I mean, I think was less intellectually than, and it was more of a gut feeling, you know, a draw. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was wired for adventurism. That's my dad was a cowboy. You know, I had a BB gun when I was 6. You know, I rode horses when I was 6. So I was always,
A BB gun, God forbid if you had a BB gun when you were a kid.
I know, there's a lot of dead lizards out there in Cuba because but
Yeah.
you know, it was I think I was wired for that, and I
Right.
like I touched upon earlier. I think God prepares us for that. So what was going in my mind was primarily something from inside of me that said, "You need to serve. This country is worth keeping." And my dad had a lot to do with that. My dad, he hadn't been in this country 6 months when he said, "We're not going back. We will become American citizens." And we became citizens. Well, we became residents the day that we could. We became citizens the day that we could. And very proud of the fact that my dad never missed an opportunity to vote in all his life.
You know, you talk about your dad a minute, and again, we'll get back to the CIA in a second.
Oh,
But there's some wonderful stories about your time in Cuba and your father, who obviously had a very strong impact on your life, and maybe he may have in subconsciously molded you uh, to choose this path. There were some interesting, people nowadays talk about Cuba, about folks. They kind of almost trivialize it in a way. In fact, there was a story in the Politico recently about the Speaker of the House. Somehow, it was some event with members of the Republican conference, and he referred to the Cuban Americans, which I know he meant this tongue in cheek. I don't quite like it. I've heard it before as all those crazy Cubans. Um, and I think sometimes people lose some perspective about what Cuba was like when you were growing up. And you talk about a lot of this in your book: gunfire, milicianos. I mean, this was not some romanticized transition to a better, the land of milk and honey, this communist paradise that they were trying to build. And I think since we're so far away from when it happened, people tend to forget. We're very passionate about this issue. I wouldn't say we're crazy about it, but there were lives at stake. There were people being killed. There were people being arrested, arbitrarily detained. Share a little bit about, before we get to the CIA part of your career, what that was like when you had a pretty happy life. It sounds like up until that point. What when you describe the shootouts in the book and what have you, how did that form you, and how has it impacted you this very day? Because we've talked about this recently, and I'd love our viewers and listeners to get a little taste of that.
yeah, you know, I did have an idyllic life. I said, you know, my dad, we were middle class. My dad had a 57 Pontiac in 59. He had a Jeep and a deuce and a half for his business. We had a TV in the house and a telephone. So we were middle class, but even by American standards, we were middle class. My dad, like I said, was a cowboy. So he instilled in me a lot of the outdoorsy thing, being confident with guns. But most importantly, he always tried to mold me to be the little man. It was like, hey, this is how men act. This is how you're supposed to. So I think that was kind of like the primer. Then started becoming the events. The very first shocking event was the town that I lived in Nicaragua, next to the Escambray Mountains, where Che Guevara was hit by the Guevara's forces, and right in front of my house. There was a firefight going on, and my parents were out of town. I ran to the window. We had a 14-year-old nanny. So I went to the window, rolled out the jealousy window, and there was a body over there. There's people shooting at each other from the cuartels to the rebels. What I didn't notice was that behind the parapet of the window was a miliciano with an automatic weapon, and all of a sudden he hops up and lets go a full blast with a machine gun.
Mm.
And of course, I'm like 2 feet away from this, So that was like my first experience with positive shock. I mean, I was both enthralled of going like, wow. Um, I think subsequently, the rebels took over. My grandfather was my maternal grandfather was another big influence in my life because he was the most stoic man I've ever met in my life, and he was very close with my dad too. So, once they confiscated my father's business, and here's the thing that people don't understand. My father had a company that employed 10 people. We were far from a monopoly kind of thing. Every machine that by my dad had a coffee roasting company is what he after he got married, that's what he started. And it was confiscated 6 months later, and they asked him, they said, well, we want you to stay and run it. And my dad said no. 6 months later, that was out of business because all the machines started breaking down, and the only guy who could fix it would have been my dad because he's the one that built them. All the roasters, all that kind of stuff. My dad did. My dad was an exceptional, gifted man when it came to handwork, and so the shock of that. Another example, right after the revolution, I was made to wear a uniform to school that had little bandanas that meant different things, and I remember at the age of around 9 having to go to campesinos' homes to teach them how to read and write. I'm 9 years old.
Wow.
And it was part of that militarization, but most of
Mhm.
it was the indoctrination. They would tell us that if anybody in our family spoke evil or ill of the revolution, and especially of Castro, that it was our duty to report them. And there's kids that did. So, going from the idyllic to that oppression that quickly, and seeing the pain of my parents losing everything, our neighbors losing everything, everybody who had a business, my grandfather, and so on, so on, so on. I think that set my path for being an avid anti-communist because I tasted it firsthand. Um, the rest is just progression. Like I said, leaving Cuba by myself to go to an orphanage in Pueblo, Colorado, where you had 3 or 4 different ethnic groups and languages, and a lot of pissed off kids because who wants to be in an orphanage, right? That was a very quick grow up lesson for me. There was a lot of inner kid violence and all that kind of stuff. We're a very strict school, it was a Catholic school. Um, and then of course my parents came out and everything was well again. I think the most beautiful example of how important my dad prepared me. I was at the airport ready to leave by myself, and my mom was just absolutely, losing it. She was just crying. And I told my dad, he says, if she doesn't stop crying, I'm not leaving. And I'll never forget it because my dad took a knee, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "You have my word, we will see you again."
Mm.
I knew that if my dad had to swim the 90 miles, I would see him again. So all the time in that orphanage, when the kids at night were crying, because there's a lot of kids, and we had about 6 or 7 Cuban kids, but the majority were, other kids, white and Native Americans and Mexican kids, and uh, I never cried because deep in my heart, my security blanket was my dad's promise.
Amen. You know, your story reminds me, the whole going to the countryside and being forced to do certain things, and the whole deprogramming or trying to deprogram a whole society. I mean, that was a huge crime that was done to the people of Cuba. My ancestors know because my parents are gone. My mom at 12, 13, roughly, she was young. They did the same thing to her. They forced her to go to the countryside and do what they tried to force you to do. and there were a lot of people who resisted, and people like your father and our grandparents and such that they knew there was no way out if they stayed. They had to leave. If they stayed behind, it was just going to be really bad. Now, so they're so grateful to this country and for everything it did for them and for us. And I was blessed to have been born here because of it. And what you've done is you channeled all that. So you could have just decided, hey, I'm just not gonna. You could be pissed off, upset about the whole thing, and your parents and your dad especially gave you a strong formation, and you channeled your entire life to doing right, to doing good, to righting a wrong. Do you think that's something that's baked into Cuban American, our psyche? That's just because of that experience, that unique experience, that break that has drawn so many Cuban Americans that hell, now we have a Secretary of State
Yep.
that's of Cuban ancestry. My wife served the State Department. We have so many people that we don't even know each other, some of them. But how do you think that formed a lot of that generation?
Well, I think the first of all, the thing I would like to highlight is a lot of people when they hear my story or read the book, they go, "Oh my God, poor kid." I didn't suffer. It
That's
was
right.
my parents. The price of my American citizenship was the sacrifice of my parents putting their only child to go to a country that they've never been at the age of 10. So I think that was pivotal there for all of us. Um, like I said, my dad, when my parents arrived, they came to this country um, dirt poor. I mean, we literally lived in ghetto homes. The only pet I had was cockroaches around the house. It was very stark contrast from where we were in Cuba to here. Um, but absolutely, I mean, you have hundreds of thousands, if not more, Cubans, especially in the first 10 years post Castro, that came to this country and were welcomed with open arms. And I think that the single biggest problem that we have in this country is that we don't know how good we have it.
Mm,
I was doing a talk, a public speech a couple of months ago, and some lady, um, when I was talking about, Cuba and traveling to, and the fact that Americans don't know how good we have it, she says to me, she says, "Well, I've been to Mexico." And I said, "No, ma'am." It was a guess, but it was right. I said, "No, ma'am. You went to Cancun on a cruise." It that typifies the mentality. I went to Cuba. It was wonderful.
mm,
They take you to a microcosm of what Cuba is, the 1/10 of Habana Vieja that has been renovated, and they have little restaurants and everything else, and everybody's happy, and they have the 57 Chevys, and everybody's enthralled with that. "Oh, Cubans are so happy." Yeah, they're happy in spite of the fact that they've been oppressed for 60 some years.
mm.
I think that gives us that realization that we know the difference between what this country's far from perfect. It's made of humans. Everybody's imperfect, but this country has something magical for people that are desperate for freedom and that want to have a better life for them and their children. I think that's tattooed in our brain.
So you took that experience, and we're not going to go into all of it because I want you all to buy the book. We'll put a link in the program notes for Rick's book. But let's pick up where we left off on your background. So you finally made it into the CIA. That was a curious way in, though. And when we talk about Cold War warriors, folks, you're looking at one right here. Somebody who was right in the belly of the battle in Central America, and you really have to buy the book to go into and appreciate what he was doing. But give us a little taste of that, of your journey into the CIA and what you were doing out in Honduras, Nicaragua during that time. You were even interacting with some legends, even in the agency, people who are no longer with us, but people who we owe a huge debt of gratitude for being still a free nation and still, I believe, a beacon of hope for billions of people around the world.
Absolutely, yeah. I applied to the agency and I had stayed in the military reserves, so I had joined the fire department, Miami-Dade, as a paramedic because as a pararescueman, I was already an EMT2 and they were just starting out their rescue program. So even as a rookie, I spent a lot of my probably 80% of my career was on a rescue truck. And so when I applied to the agency, what they brought me in was on contract in 1980 to help to have okay, CIA has a special activities division. Now it's called center, but back then it was special activities division, which comes directly from the roots of the OSS of World War II. And that unit only hires people from the special operations community that I mentioned earlier. Well, they needed a paramilitary guy that could fit in and was a medic. So when they were having some training or when they were going to have a mission, the job was that I would go take off of work for 3 weeks or whatever. The fire department was very cool with it because the chief knew what I was doing, and I would go. Well, what happened was Reagan comes in shortly thereafter, and he declares war on communism in our hemisphere, or writ large, but starting with our hemisphere. And as you know, Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Bolivia, all these places were in turmoil because the Soviet intervention via Cuba fomenting those kind of problems. So when the requirement came down, the Title 50 requirement from the agency came down and said we need to start a program to help the Contras, the guys who were fighting against the Sandinista regime, which, by the way, declared themselves communists the day that they took power. It wasn't like Castro waited 6 months or something, but this just happened right immediately. So the attrition post Vietnam in military and in the agency, and attrition is something that we always see when there's big changes in our government. Post Vietnam, the military and the agency were decimated.
Mm,
Everything was drawn down, and they did not have a single native Spanish speaking paramilitary officer.
that's amazing to hear that.
Well, they had plenty of native Spanish speaking case officers,
Right.
had a whole bunch of very, very sharp paramilitary guys, but one that could pass off as a non-American, they did not have. And that's when they asked me to join, not contract, but actually go in staff. And the title of the book, Black Ops, is exactly that. The Black Ops are the operations that need to be done, but they have to hide the American hand. So for the first 14 months of that program, and I was there for 3 years, a little over 3 years. For the first 14 months of that program, I was the only CIA officer allowed in the camps. We had 10 camps, and Jason, I slept in a jungle hammock for over 3 years, Monday through Friday. I would come home on the weekends, and I never ever regretted a thing. Why? Because now I'm a 30-year-old full of piss and vinegar guy, and I am now helping the Contras and leading him in some cases to fight the very same monster that destroyed our first country. So
Amen.
for me, it was nirvana. The second part was the purity of the people that I dealt with. Most of them were peasants, and none of them talked about Marx or Lenin. They all talked about, their daughter being raped by the Sandinistas, their son being conscripted, their church being burned down, and their priest, abused. So it was a very, very special time for me. And I indeed met some incredible people like, Bill Casey, who was our DCI. I was a GS-10. And when I'm talking directly to my DCI when he came to Honduras, because I was the only guy in the camps.
Mm.
Louis Claridge, who was a mentor of mine throughout my career and legendary case officer. So it was a wonderful time that even though I was a junior officer, it really highlighted me to the senior officers because I was the only guy doing it. So yeah,
That's
very
that's that's pretty remarkable. I mean, a lot of you young ones who don't know who Bill Casey is, look it up. That's that must have been amazing. How was that, by the way? You talk a little bit about it in the book, but how was it to meet him,
it
especially in
was
in the field?
Well, you can imagine, I'm in one of the camps and I get a call from Colonel Ray Doty, who was my boss. He says, "You need to come in." So
Mm,
they send a helicopter and they pick me up and they bring me back. And when I walk into the office, there's Dewey Claridge. I didn't know who Dewey Claridge was. I get introduced to Dewey Claridge.
wow.
And Dewey Claridge at the time, they used to call him Bill Casey's pit bull. He's the one that created the counterterrorist center a few years later. So he says to me, he says, our director of the agency, Bill Casey's here, and I want you to meet him. And he takes me to the other room and he says to the director, says, "Mr. Director, this is your man in the camps, Alex Mendez." I was there in alias. I was there as Major Alex Mendez, Honduran backstop my cover. And so you can imagine, I'm a GS nothing, and I'm not only meeting, with Dewey Claridge, but I'm meeting with the number one guy. And for those that do look it up, Bill Casey was an original OSS member. He was, one of these guys that goes back to World War II. So it was I have to admit I was nervous. But what he said to me that really broke the ice, he says, "So you're the one that is sending me all those great
The
photos."
photos, because you were sending photos back.
Yeah, constantly, because nobody else knew. I mean, they were seeing through my eyes. So photography was a big thing for me, taking and documenting. And he said, "Keep sending them because every time some liberal comes to me and wants to turn down that program, I hit him over the forehead with your photos." And I'm going like, "Wow, that's my DCI, right?" And then I ended up interpreting for him twice, which was again, high
That's
point.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Let me ask you something. You mentioned just now Black Ops, and to folks outside the government who have a, let's just say, a less than positive view about that type of work, and even some people to this very day in Congress who have a negative view of that type of work. How do you explain it to the layperson why we have to do this kind of work?
Well, that's what the book is about, and here was the impetus for the book, Jason. Another conscious, guilt kind of thing was when I retired and I had time for a little introspection. Um, I realized that of the 141 stars that we have in our Wall of Honor, about a third of that are post 9/11.
Wow.
And those are people that I either knew and maybe even sent into harm's way. Now, you got to understand 141 may not sound like a lot if you're in the military, but the agency is a microcosm of even other federal agencies, especially our operational components, are tiny. It's tiny. And it came to me through the introspection that there was so much bad press against the agency, which drives me nuts. We're all immoral, trading secrets, killing people without authorities, all this kind of stuff, which is all Hollywood BS, right? So I figured that I owed these stars on the wall something that the widow of could pass to their kids and say, "This is the kind of thing that your daddy did during the war." And that was the kickoff point for me writing the book.
Well, it's an amazing read, and I think folks need to, who are even somewhat interested in this but want to learn more about the important role that this type of work is used for, should really look at it. Before we jump off to second half of your life, before we get to 9/11, I hear a lot of people now. We've been involved for a long time. My wife and I and a bunch of our friends, and in liberty work and in the hemisphere especially, but we've done this sort of thing in other parts of the world, and we meet with a lot of dissidents and resistance leaders and what have you. And last few, maybe 20 years or so, there's this level of frustration especially in some of the diasporas, Nicaraguan, Cuban, Venezuelan. And I find myself repeating this over and over again, is that if you want to liberate something, if you want to fight for something, you can't do it thousands of miles away from where the problems are happening. And you have people who, in fact, let's bring this current, what's happening with these audits of USAID and State Department programs. that are quote democracy building. But I become very critical of these programs because if you don't have those are tools in our foreign policy arsenal. They can't replace the policy of the leadership. What message do you have for folks as the Trump administration is going through this? I'm one of these who think that all these programs, a lot of them need to be shelved, and we have to start from scratch and do things that maybe the enemy doesn't know that we're doing, because we kind of announce to people, oh, we're going to go train journalists. But if you can't even get into Cuba, for example, or if Ortega has kicked you out, which by the way, he's banned all these groups. You can't be an American nonprofit and receive US taxpayer money and be doing this work in Nicaragua. So most people are in Costa Rica or Miami. But it's been a lot of money though. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. Most of the money stays out here. What can we draw from that? Because I'm not saying that this all should be a black op. That's not what I'm saying. But I also think that there's a this illusion that somehow we can change something or influence something thousands of miles away, but you're not there. What do you say to folks now who are studying these programs? What should they be looking out for?
Well, USAID, I work with them because my cover was always State Department cover. So everywhere I went, we had a USAID individual representatives. And they were always problematic because they were very idealistic individuals that when you look at some of the millions and dollars of stuff that has been spent on really incredible things, like, sex changes for kids in Uganda or something, whatever. Um, so that is something that needs to be looked at, just like your home economics. If you owe so much debt that your paycheck doesn't even make cover the payments, and that's where this country's at almost right now. You have to have the discipline to cut back, and a lot of times that is painful. As far as the outreach, and again, I can only speak on behalf of the agency because that's my grounding. Um, we can make a difference from miles away as long as we can get people close enough to the ones that are doing something. I'll give you an example. About 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when the Venezuela thing was again really boiling up, the CIA's rep to the NSC was a friend of mine, Juan Cruz. So I call Juan. I go, Juan, what are you guys doing about Venezuela? Well, they're desperate groups and they don't get along and blah blah blah. And I said, look, what you need to do is create a Contra program part two. At the time, Colombia was a very, very strong supporter, very, very great relationship with the United States. And I said, get Colombia to be our Honduras, provide the support. When people come out, we send the trainers, and now you have an armed force of believers, not mercenaries, believers that can counter the Sandinistas. It's hard to fight guys with AK-47s where all you have is a pocket knife and no training. So, and that is why black the Contra program was a black op, because we did not want to tip our hand that the United States was involved in there. And that comes under what is called Title 50 authorities. The CIA is the only agency, federal agency in this country that has Title 50 authorities. And all that means is that the President of the United States, he or she, signs a lethal finding or any finding, we are allowed to do it. And that's a black op because, again, they're signing it in private. It's not for public consumption. And I know things have changed with the internet and people posting it, but the Contra program was secret probably for the first year and a half plus. So it was very well kept. Of course, at the end, and things start. Reporters are coming into Honduras and Nicaragua, and they start seeing things. But that's the
Well, I think we say too much today, and in the case of Cuba programs, you're giving them a roadmap to where you're spending the money and who's spending it and for what, and you're just handing them political ammunition, and ultimately, that doesn't help. I think over the long run, and I've lost friends down there, and we have people who have had to leave mostly because of reckless posting of information on the internet about people who were going about doing very peaceful things, sharing your rights, for example. Wow, that's controversial, sharing your rights with someone. Then at the same time, we let these diplomats run free in our country, which I can't quite figure that out. And here we are. I mean, millions of dollars, billions of dollars into these programs, and we're still talking about freedom 90 miles away. But hopefully, it's going to change now. Um, Back to you again. You talked. There were a few seminal moments in your life that come out of your book. Leaving Cuba, forced to leave, how you left, all that work you did in Central America, and then in other parts of the world, which we're not going to get into. You got to buy the book. Another one that really stands out toward the middle end or start middle end of your career was 9/11, and you at that point start to kind of get a little flavor of what I call beltway fever. I guess eventually you got a little beltway fever. Um, Tell us a little bit about what 9/11 was like, how you were brought into it, but then also we got about 15, 20 more minutes. How that laid the foundation for the crystal marbles that you talk about in your book.
Well, I mean, I think the story has to begin with in 1996 when we opened the Bin Laden task force. I was the deputy chief of station for the Bin Laden station. And so that's the first time I heard of Bin Laden. That's the first time we started following Bin Laden. And within a year, we had enough locational information and irrefutable evidence from everything from satellite photographs of him building, terrorist training camps. And he was in Khartoum at the time. So that began my exposure to politics. And I said this to you when we met. You cannot run military or intel operations through a political optic. You know, so they started with this all this the stuff that was going on. We were coming up with real viable operations so where we could have taken out. And I don't mean just shooting. We could have just kidnapped him out of Khartoum because he felt that he was above reproach there, that he could not be approached. We could have gotten him. And the administration never had the 40. Oh, we don't have enough intelligence. We're getting it from liaison sources. We're getting unilateral, getting overhead, signals. Everything was telling us this guy is building something massive and evil, which became Al Qaeda. Uh, Imagine if we would have been allowed to neutralize somehow bin Laden in 1997. It would be like killing Hitler in 1938
Mm.
because it would have changed world history in the suffering of millions. So that was my foundation in that particular. Then come 9/11, I took over as chief of operations for the Counterterrorist Center in May of 2001. After coming out of a very radical Muslim country that I ran operations in for about a year. But anyway, I had a unique background in what was going on because I did start the Bin Laden task
So,
force.
Rick, before we get to the Bin Laden task force, tell people who are not familiar with the CIA and that unit what exactly do they do there?
The Counterterrorist Center, it is the president's tool for fighting terrorism. We coordinate with our special military to assist us. Like when we shot Bin Laden, that was a CIA operation that was carried out by Navy SEALs because they were under our command for because of the Title 50 authorities that I mentioned earlier. The CTC, the Counterterrorist Center, is the only place in the whole agency where every single federal agency is represented. We have Secret Service, diplomatic security, ATF. We have you name it, we have it, and DEA and so on, and military presence there. So it's kind of like the collating place for actionable intelligence. Okay, there is the National Counterterrorism Center, whatever the heck it's called, but that's more of a political slash, I don't know. I really don't know what they do. It's one of those that needs to be looked at by the millions and billions. but primarily that's what it is. It's the epicenter of countering terrorism. And our job is not to retaliate. Our job is to prevent and preempt.
Do you think we use it as much as we should?
Oh no, we don't use any of our tools as much as we should. I mean, look,
I agree.
another problem a problem that we have is that we are ashamed of being powerful. For some reason, we as Americans feel guilty that we could kick just about everybody's butt. And that's not realistic. Because if you're putting your prowess to good use
Amen.
and for the better of a then that prowess is very well justified in the eyes of the only person that I really care about, is this guy upstairs.
Amen.
So
So we'll share some links with some background so folks can do some more research on that. So then not so you've transitioned, and by the way, we left a huge chunk of his life out because there's a lot to read. But this part's fascinating though, because his transition into Washington and what happened and how it happened was a very telling story, a story that keeps happening a lot. It's happening now. So 9/11 happens. Tell folks what, your reaction, what happened.
well, obviously, we immediately had try to figure out exactly who it was. Hezbollah before that had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group, 240 something. Um, but we were hearing a lot of information and a lot of what we call chatter, either from trailing and surveilling couriers to intercepts and everything else, that there was something major coming up, and we knew we were going to get hit. We knew it was going to be in the United States, but we did not know what and when. And that became, well, obviously, the finding that the president signed in 17 September allowed us to go into Afghanistan. And this is a very important point. The first American boots on the ground in Afghanistan was not the military. It was my guys,
Was that Jawbreaker or was that
John Baker.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, the special forces team that they refer to as Triple Nickel 555. It was my guys on the ground vectoring those two helicopters in, and that's something that's most often overlooked. The Green Berets deserve every single accolade that they got for that period and other military units that joined afterwards. But the first military boots on the ground were the Green Berets. But the first boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, was the CIA.
Mm.
So that became part of that war. And then, as chief of ops, I went to my boss, Cofer Black, another legendary CIA officer and mentor. And I said, boss, we're kicking the crap out of these guys in Afghanistan, but the support mechanisms for all these bad people are running around in first, second, and third world countries with impunity. And that's the way we need to go after them, was to be able to preempt. That was my frustration. And this is where this idea came from, was the fact that I know that all this stuff is going on. I know that we're going to get hit. And there wasn't a damn thing that I had in my toolbox that I could use to prevent it. So I came up with a very successful program. I was able to brief it to the Vice President of the United States and Condoleezza Rice. And it was primarily an intelligence collection through all sources, but especially surveillance, but with teeth. Each target was going to be looked at, geolocated, find what they call find, fix, and finish. We found, we fixed, and then we had three different scenarios for every target to disrupt that individual. It could be compromise, it could be kidnapping, it could be shooting them. And this was not a retaliatory effort. This was something to have on the shelf. And then when you were having this kind of chatter from any terrorist group, you could go out and disrupt them, because all of a sudden, three of their major support mechanisms in first, second, and third world countries get neutralized.
Mm.
They're going to stop whatever they're doing because they feel that they're penetrated. So that was important. I did that for 2 years. We were extremely successful. And the things that you see that are blacked out are the things that we were able to do, how we were able to track these guys down to, what they had for lunch.
I was gonna ask you about that. There's a lot in that latter part of the book that's still blacked out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, there was a lot of things that I didn't even consider writing about, because I know that they were too you know, secret and they need to remain that way. Um, and there's things that I put out there that I was hoping, and the blackout is where they didn't. I mean, they allowed me to talk about the teams that I built, the reason behind it, but then our actual successes, that gets diluted. There's a lot you could read between the hash marks, but what that prepared me for was, now I'm dealing with the seventh floor. I'm dealing with politics. I'm briefing the vice president of the United States. And after 2 years, we still were not being used. We were more of a paper tiger that briefs well. We had actually geolocated 5 really bad guys in less than 6 months, but we were not able to go out and do anything, even though we knew that they were involved in some real bad stuff. So when the second operation that I proposed, that including the one that was briefed to the vice president, was shot down for political reasons. When there was one particular target, was very, very, very bad guy, and we had spent a good 6 months tracking him down. We knew exactly where he was going to be when, and we had the proposal. And I briefed the director of operations for the CIA, Jim Pavitt at the time, and the director of the CIA, George Tenet at the time, and I briefed him on the program. And at the end of the program, I mean, of the briefing, the director of operations looks at the DCI and says, Director, Mr. Director, there's no doubt in our mind that Prado cannot, and his team can not only get this done, but get away with it. I went, ah, but then he says, however, we need to look at the political ramifications of doing this at this time.
So let's pause there 1 second. Go back to meeting the vice president, and you had that interaction with the policymaker, that world, the consumers, and then we're going to jump back to that. What was it like? Because from your book, I can tell that it was very well received.
Yes. Yeah, it was first of all for me, a little Cuban kid from Hialeah, and I'm walking into the White House to brief the vice president and Condoleezza Rice. I mean, all I could think of at the time was, "Well, I wish I could tell my parents. I wish I could tell my parents," but at the time I could not. Yeah, that was extremely welcome. I actually, for the sense of dramatics, I brought the camera. I was on the ground when we surveilled this guy. We had this guy's on video, and I was on the ground when we got that. I even had keys to his car. We had been able to obtain keys to his car to compromise him or whatever. But anyway, uh, I briefed the vice president in great detail. Put his hand on the desk and goes, "That's exactly the kind of thing CIA is supposed to be doing. Please thank your people." This is after I showed him the video, and I'm literally holding the camera in front of him over his left shoulder, Condi's over his right shoulder. I'm going like, I got my hand on the vice president's shoulder showing him this movie, right? Um, he shook my hand at the end and said, "Please thank your guys and gals for doing this. Come back to me as soon as you're ready, and we will brief the right people in Congress." That never happened. Here you have and the DCI was there, and the DDO was there, and Jose Rodriguez, the head of the counterterrorism center then, because Kofor had left, very good friend of mine, another great leader. Um, but the DCI never let that filter back. Nobody went back to the vice president and say, "Hey, we're ready to do this one. What do you think?" So after 2 years of that frustration, I decided it was time for me to leave and to dissolve the team, because I had been given pick of the litter. I had, of my 4 operating officers, all of them retired as flag ranked officers in the agency. My deputy retired as an SIS 5, which is like a 5-star in our world, right? And that's when I decided to pull the plug. And I will tell you that it was a very tough time for me, because I never worked a day in my life.
Mm.
Every day I was excited, and any time that I was tired, all I had to think was, I'm the little Cuban boy from Hialeah, and I'm chief of ops at the counterterrorism center. And so when I did retire, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of pain because I left on the terms that, shouldn't have happened to begin with. Let's put it that way. So this is where it gets down to the marbles that you wanted me to talk about. I came home. My cousin had come up to visit. He had taken us out to lunch for my retirement ceremony, and my wife knows when to give me distance. We've been married 42 years. She looks at me, she goes, let me go this way. And I was in a very, very, very dark mood. So I grabbed the bottle of Italian Barolo and one of my biggest cigars, and I sat out in the we had a gazebo in back of our house in Virginia. And I decided that I was going to go through my career in the agency from day one in the Contras to yesterday, kind of thing. Okay. And when I started thinking about it, I could see the good memories, the good memories, the good memories. This was a bad memory. This and this. And I started playing a game in my own mind that for every time that I saw something that was worth keeping in my heart, I would take a glass marble and put it in a basket. And every time I came across a bad thing, something that could have been avoided or should have been avoided, I took that black marble and put it in the trash. And at the end of the day, and I actually recreated it. You saw it in my
Yeah.
office.
Yeah.
I have this big glass full of crystal marbles because at the end of the day, they outweighed all the negative BS. And the reason that was important was because I have friends who had left the agency very bitter. And I wasn't prepared to do that because I love the agency. I love my colleagues. I was in awe of just about everybody I work with, for, and to, So I could not throw away 24 and plus years of my career and just putting it in the trash can. Oh, CIA. So that's not true. So it was hell of a good, but it was a very, it was medicinal. I mean, it literally, I came out of there feeling like, hey, look, you did your part, and it was just your time to go. So
So let me ask you as we start to wrap up, I got two more questions. One, the last one will be, of course, lessons for advice you have for anyone, even on the fence about a career either at CIA or foreign service or any government service. But I want you to share the story of your interaction with a senator from the great state of California, because I think it encapsulates for me. Remember, I look at this from the political lens, right? I spent a lot of time in politics. In fact, I grew up. My family didn't like it from a very young age. I was always drawn to politics, and I've always been seeing interesting things. Either I grew up in Miami, so I grew up in the Cold War, looking at the Cold War through that lens. We were like the hub, and you would see things. But then I spent spending 30 years in Washington D.C. looking at it from the political side, and I've seen politicians at their greatest, and I've seen politicians probably not at their greatest. And there's one account in your book which I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. I've been in many of those meetings on the political side. But what was it like to sit there and essentially have to take it for a very powerful senator and somebody who pretty much, in my opinion, was insulting and lying, but or maybe she was misinformed. I have no idea. But share a little bit about that because I think it says a lot about the Washington of today.
she was lying because everything that we brief, including Jose Rodriguez later on with enhanced interrogations, we have record of. So that's BS. That you're talking about Feinstein. What happened was she had two constituents of hers that had been kidnapped in the Philippines. Well, I served in the Philippines. I knew the Philippines, and now I'm chief of ops. And my counterpart in the NSC was a general, um, Wayne Downing, a super gentleman, with whom I used to talk almost every other day because, again, I was the rep for the NSC for counterterrorism too. So she calls us in because she wants to make a demand of why aren't we rescuing, her two constituents from the hands of And this is in Mindanao, southern Philippines, where not even the Filipinos military go in there except with a massive force of attack, right?
A hellhole.
Yeah, it's a hellhole. I mean, yeah, it was one of the most dangerous places I ever surfed around in. And we trying to explain to her. She's saying, "Well, you need to go. Why can't you go in there and take them out and kill the guys and grab them and take them out?" I said, "Ma'am, we can do that, but we don't have the authorities. That has to come from you. Going into another country without their blessing to do a military operation is actually an act of war." And she went on and on and on. Yes, you guys always, have an excuse for everything. The amount of money that we give the special operation military, of which, I mean, uh, Wayne was the chief of SOCOM at one time, Special Operations Command. And you, CIA, blah, 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 blah. And we just had, like you said, we had to take it, right? We walk out and Wayne Downing puts his hand on my shoulder. He goes, "What would you pay to have a recording of that conversation?" I looked him up and I said, "My left testicle." And we both left her office laughing, and she's looking at us like, "What are they laughing about?" But it was the most vile representation of a politician that I've ever seen in my life. First of all, she knew better. She was just playing politics. Second, she had a thing for us collectively, the community, the Intel community, of which the NSC, of course, is a big part of. And she was just being her. It was brutal. It was disrespectful. Come on, Wayne Downing was a four-star general. I was an SIS two with just two stars in my organization, and she's talking to us like we're bastard kids that don't know, and she was wrong. And we
Mm.
tried to explain to her the legalities behind. There's a big difference between can do and should do or are allowed to do. And that takes some paperwork to be done. And I knew that the president wanted to do it, was not going to do a Title 50 finding for us to go into the Philippines and try to kill. It doesn't work that way. That's fantasy.
You know,
Very
without
dis-
without getting into it, because partly we don't have time, but also because I probably not useful for the families going through this right now. But one of the frustrations that I find in the work that we do, advising and working with Americans wrongfully imprisoned in foreign countries or held hostage, is trying to explain this bureaucratic, I think, inertia to the point where, I was not a big fan of a law that was passed a few years ago. It all started during the Obama period after it was horrible killing of a lot of Americans, and they react, the bureaucracy reacts, not the bureaucracy, the politicians react, and then they move these components around, give it a new name, create a new office, throw some money at it, make more bureaucracy, and then you show you're doing something. And in this space, when it comes to wrongful detention and kidnappings and what have you, we have the best the world has to help. We just have to empower them to do their job. We don't have to create new offices or new agencies. And one of the reasons why I was not a big supporter of it, creating this office at the State Department, is precisely because we don't have to announce to the enemy what we're doing or how we're doing it, and not creating a market for hostage taking, which right now you're seeing a very graphic.
very
I mean, what's happening now in Israel with Hamas, what Iran does, Cuba's doing it. You're basically creating a market for them. They're gaming our bureaucracy and our system. There's no need to do that. And that meeting that you had, which I know you're holding back, uh, it's offense. I've seen Republicans do it too, though. It's not just Democrats doing this. I've seen both sides because they want to put a good show on for their constituents, or in the case of some of the Democrats, they just do not like the CIA, and they will never ever miss an opportunity to, you know, play politics with it. And I just think we do a huge disservice to Americans by politicizing cases like these because it only encourages the bad actors to do more of it.
absolutely. You're
So,
absolutely it's spot on, Jason.
so we got to work a little bit on that. But as we wrap up, Rick, thank you so much for the time you spent with us. And I could go on, but we got to wrap it up. What pieces of advice, what nuggets do you have for young people or even people in the government looking to move around in light of what's happening now with, we agree our government's in debt, big debt. It's about time that we started to clean it up, especially get a handle on our deficit and money and wasteful programs. But at the same time, these sorts of activities are extremely important to keep our nation safe. It should be the place where we should be investing more money, not less money. A lot of people think we invest too much in this space. I think we do not invest anywhere near as much as we should.
You're right.
But for people who are considering a career doing what you do, what pieces of advice beyond reading your book do you have for them?
Well, that's an excellent question. I do a lot of mentoring because I got 50 years in the special operations community. So there's a lot of young guys and gals that want to get into the game and they reach out through social media. And I take it on board because it's my only way to pay forward the Dewey Claridges and the Bill Caseys of the world for the care and grooming that they did with me. The first thing that I can tell people is that a job, and I can only speak directly on the CIA because that's my alma mater. Um, the one thing that you have is the understanding that it is not a job, it's a vocation. In the military, of which I'm very proud of, my beret is hanging right back here. Um, we get ribbons and jump wings and scuba badges and cool berets. In CIA, you walk around and the badge of a brand new officer and the branch of your boss's boss are the same. Blue badge with your picture. The only thing that changes is your picture. So it is a vocation. There's sacrifices that need anonymity, where Johnny could come home and tell his kids that, I sold 15 cars today at the dealer. We can't, you know. So that part of it is very important that you go in there for the right reasons. Okay. Now, preparation for these things. There's obviously a checklist for anything in the special communities that people need to check the boxes in order to qualify for that. Yeah, to enter the CIA, you as an operations officer or as an intel analyst, there's other jobs where security and logistics and everything else where you don't. You have to have at least a 4-year degree. So you have to, have that. Things that they're looking for. Second language. The second language is a big deal. Why? Because we don't operate in the United States or in the UK. We operate worldwide. Thus, we do not send an officer overseas with at least a 3 level operational language capability. So languages, if you have a second language, and especially if you have a second language and you've done some foreign travel or foreign exposure, that is a big deal. Obviously, having a military background of any kind, whether it's intelligence or, if you were military for a medic or a doctor or whatever, those are big hash marks because that means you have already basic clearances or advanced clearances in some cases, which proves that, you have been clear so far, so it's easier to invest. Keep in mind that every day there's hundreds, if not thousands, of applications that go into our website, and a big number of them are kooks, and they have to go through the shaft. So, um, those are the things. I would like to close with our new DCI's comment to Congress, which I thought it was classic. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. He said, "My goal is to rebuild the agency, the CIA, in the likeness of the OSS of World War II.
Mm,
Other words, sir, I want to hire men and women with PhDs who can win a bar fight." And then he said, for those who are attracted to this kind of a venture, to this kind of service, please come in because we need you.
mm.
Then he said, however, if you're already in and you don't believe in that, maybe it's time for you to go. And that was a message to a lot of the political, you know, uh, buildup of the internal in CIA, where it has been politicized, just like the FBI. When I was in the agency, I could not have a sticker on my car that was a political sticker of any kind. That was not allowed. And now here we have people that are actually hiding information or making up information. to help a political ideal, and that's not what we're supposed to do. So those are the things that I would
Yeah.
encourage somebody that's interested to prep up on, and you know,
Well, Rick, it's been amazing. Thank you for spending a little bit of your day with us. Ilem sends her regards to Carmen. I hope you guys have a good weekend coming up, and you're always welcome to join us here.
thank you very much. You know, you're always welcome up here also.
Thank you.
Take care, my friend.
Take care, sir.